Andrew, are you on the air?
Yes.
How are you doing?
Can't see you. Good, good. I'm just listening to your introduction there. I would just like to stress that, I'm often asked why I'm leading a truth campaign that essentially has two major fronts. I'm actively researching the fact that NASA's own photographs show that Mars is inhabited. So we're going to have to come to terms with that as a common culture. Meanwhile, I'm reaching back 40 years to my childhood experiences and talking about what I experienced in DARPA's time-space exploration program, Project Pegasus. The common linkage is the fact that because DARPA was already sending personnel to the future via teleportation-based time travel, as well as propagating holographic images of future events, the United States government was in possession of my Mars writings, establishing that Mars is inhabited. When I was a child on Project Pegasus, I was permitted, for example, to read my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, in 1971, 37 years before it was written. At least it was a version of the paper that was taken from whatever future timeline that they sampled, that they visited, to bring back so that I could read it as a child. I have no way of comparing what I read in 1971 with what I wrote in 2008, and that's now posted in PDF format on the Internet for the entire world to read and see that Mars is indeed an inhabited planet. But the commonality is that this was one of the data points from the future that they had discerned by the early 1970s.
Right.
And I want to really emphasize that. It may have, in fact, been the reason why, as a small child, I was placed in a classified defense-related research and development project where such unusual activities were going on. If I might add, a number of the other future events that they were aware of, because I was essentially an insider in the social culture of the project. My late father, Raymond F. Basiago, was an engineer for the Ralph M. Parsons Company. A number of the engineers on the project were, in fact, Parsons personnel. And so, in addition to being a child on the project and doing the things that they wanted to use children for, for example, to test teleportation on children, to use us as participant observers of the past and future events that they were modeling holographically in the chronovisors, I also was sort of brought into the inner culture of the project because I was my father's son.
Right.
And in that context, sharing lunch and dinner with project personnel in Albuquerque and so forth, there were discussions going on about events in the future that were finding their way into the intelligence reports that Project Pegasus was collecting for the CIA. And I know to a personal certainty that among the future events the U.S. government was already aware of, let's say by no later than summer of 1971, was the advent of the Internet. There was a discussion of the Internet at one of the lunches, just on a casual basis. They were aware of the emergence of AIDS as an epidemic disease. They didn't call it that, but they described the transmissibility of AIDS and the fact that there would be a disease where individuals could sexually transmit a fatal, that is to say, a potentially lethal virus. Also, 9/11 was discussed in my presence, and the engineers would have heard some shop talk. Isn't there some kind of domestic Pearl Harbor that's linked to the word 911? And my late father and I also went down. We drove down to the Aerojet Corporation facility that once existed in Socorro, New Mexico, and actually saw about an 18 to 20 second film loop of one of the planes hitting one of the Twin Towers 30 years in the future. So they knew about the Internet, about AIDS and its impact on society. They were aware of 9/11, and they also were actively tracking the individuals who were destined to become president. And I'm stating this with 100% conviction because these future events were discussed in my presence, and there was an intentional effort made to allow me to see and read my Mars findings literally decades before I'd be responsible for originally creating them. So those are some of the future events I'm aware of that the Defense Department had already ascertained. And
in these discussions that you heard them talking about these future events, did mention anything about maybe preventing them, or it was just
no,
something?
There was a widespread consensus on the project that they should not play God and intervene and prevent future events based on foreknowledge of them. In fact, Bob Beckwith, who was one of the consulting engineers from he had a background with General Electric, once began discussing the prospect of engaging in quantum engineering. And the fellow engineers at the lunch table kind of scowled. They were fairly certain that they shouldn't do that, but that they should use quantum access to future events to engage in contingency planning for them, because the thrust of Project Pegasus was not time travel per se, but as was expressed in a DARPA paper, in the nature of a scientific paper, a policy paper that I was asked to read, was remote sensing in time. It was essentially an intelligence gathering project, and they were passing that information along to the president and other executive branch officials. One of the practical conundrums of acting in the present to prevent unfavorable future events is that if you prevent a major event, let's say like 9/11, that has a profound impact on certainly the entire world,
Right.
You basically diminish the value of the intelligence database that you're gathering about future events after that point. So one of the practical paradoxes of time-space exploration is that if you do that, if you go forward and try to avert an event as tragic as 9/11, for example, the consequence is if you decide to do that, you then have to catch up and figure out what happens after that now that you've prevented the event from happening. But there was actually, in other words, an institutional decision that had been made to not play God and, for example, inform people of an accident they could avert or prevent a negative event. There was, however, I think an equally estimable consensus that if they knew something was going to happen and they thought it was favorable, they could certainly take action to try to enhance its likelihood of happening. For example, that's what I think they were doing, or at least that it would happen in a favorable way. And I think that's what they were doing when they were reaching out to individuals that they knew were destined to become president,
Right.
and apprising them of the fact that 20, 30 years hence they would be president of the United States and leader of the free world, so that they could psychologically adjust to that fact and get ready to serve. Because we know they did that in regard to both George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush and Barack Obama, for reasons that you and I have discussed, which is that we met the Bushes when we were on the project in Albuquerque in the early 70s, and George W. Bush was going around the table with project people. I think they had just been informed of that fact. This was right around the time that George H.W. Bush was just running for Congress. He hadn't even been CIA director yet. But
Really?
Bush, the younger, was circulating around the room joking, that my daddy and I are going to be president someday. And then, of course, there was the 1982 meeting that I happened just as a matter of serendipity when I was an undergraduate at UCLA and was introduced to Barack Obama in the West Los Angeles apartment of an anti-apartheid activist when Barack Obama was in Los Angeles visiting his friends that he had made during his first 2 years of college at Occidental College in Eagle Rock, California. And it was during that meeting that Barack Obama's friend informed me that he was going to be president of the United States someday. So we certainly know in the same way that they reached out to me and apprised me of the fact that I was going to be playing a significant social role in humanity's understanding that Mars is inhabited.
Right.
We know they were intervening in the lives of future presidents and at a minimum informed them of what their destinies were.
And you got involved in Project Pegasus at the age of 10. And
No, actually, I first teleported from the old Curtiss Wright facility in Woodridge, New Jersey. There was a teleport there in Building 68 to the State Capitol Complex in Santa Fe, New Mexico, as a 6-year-old. And from there,
that early.
Right. Yeah, because during that visit, we met with Dr. Harold M. Agnew, one of the Manhattan Project physicists, when he was director of the Weapons Division, the W Division, at the Los Alamos National Labs, before he became director of LANL in 1970. And Dr. Agnew asked my father during that meeting how old I was, and we both answered simultaneously 6. So from that, we can derive the fact that I teleported no later than sometime between September of 1967 and 68 because I was born in September of 1961. That was the earliest time that I teleported to New Mexico with my dad that I can remember. There may have been an early one when I was about 4. And then...
Oh, I'm sorry. And that was at a school, right? Was it a machine that they brought to the school?
Well, they brought one of the quantum access devices to the learning lab that they were using to train us beginning in September of 1969, which for me was my 3rd grade year. And that was the Montauk chair, which is the quantum access device that's featured so prominently in the books about Project Montauk by Preston Nichols and Peter Moon. I can certainly affirm that that device exists. What it is a magnetic resonator that prompts your mind to experiences in your own subjective future.
Right.
And that they brought into the learning lab. However, the teleport was located out at the Curtiss-Wright Aeronautical Company facility. And the chronovisor locations were in Convent Station, at the General Manufacturing Company facility, and then also in Morristown, New Jersey, and also there was a chronovisor probe to the future that we undertook up at ITT Defense Communications in Nutley, New Jersey. So some of the quantum access activity occurred in the learning lab, but really they're beginning in summer of 70 when they started to involve us directly in quantum access. We were usually being taken off campus to some of these defense contractor locations.
And okay, so now when you got involved in that, at 6 years old, it must have been very frightening to see that. How was the children picked for this project?
We don't know. We know that there was a project launched that Duncan O'Finian has narrated his experiences in called Project Talent. We know that was launched by Admiral Hyman Rickover, the father of the nuclear navy, in the late 1950s because he was concerned about the caliber of the undergraduates that he was receiving at the Naval Academy. In other words, he was concerned that the average plebe at Annapolis was not somebody that over the years he could cultivate into a nuclear submarine captain. Mm-hmm. So he launched a program to begin identifying young Americans of exceptional intelligence, psychic ability, and leadership potential. And they began to be placed in classified projects to give them an early exposure to the activities of the Defense Department, beginning in around the mid-1960s. And so that may be the genesis of my involvement in Project Pegasus. Certainly it's the institutional background for that. But when I went and searched for the truth of what happened to me in Project Pegasus, beginning around the year 2000, I've been at this for about 10 years now, gathering information about what happened to me so I could share it with others. That was one of the questions I really couldn't get a definitive answer to. It's certainly possible that I was selected not just because I was demonstrating non-ordinary abilities, and my father had informed the government that I possessed those non-ordinary abilities, because for the 10 years before I was born, he had been involved in different classified aerospace projects. For example, he was on the B-70 project, which was one of the strategic bomber projects. He was one of the designers of the ramjet engine at Curtiss-Wright for the U.S. Air Force, which was the high-performance jet aircraft that we began building in October of 1952 after the July 1952 overflight of Washington, D.C. By 9 UFOs that were clocked as traveling at 7,000 miles per hour. Right. So my dad had been involved in classified engineering work for the government really before my birth. And we know that I had demonstrated some extraordinary things as a very small child. So we think he may have passed my profile on to the government. And we know that when I was in kindergarten, he was approached by the U.S. Army at work and asked to involve me in Project Pegasus. So it's still kind of murky why I was selected. It's quite possible that the project people from the future that I ultimately found that Project Pegasus was in communication with, they were literally in collaboration with a group of project people in the year 2045. So those team members, operating on the basis of the historical knowledge that I had been placed in Project Pegasus as a child, may very well have instructed the U.S. government at the appropriate time to involve me in the project, so that the destiny that they were aware of as a past event could manifest in the present.
I was just going to add that oftentimes they pick children in these projects based on genetics, too.
Well, we know the CIA was in possession of the Nazi occult bureau records that Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler had been gathering since 1919 when they founded the Thule Society, the Thule Group. And that contained information about certain German and Italian bloodlines because of the Axis alliance during World War II. Mussolini shared some of his data with them. And we know those files entered the Nazi intelligence archive that Reinhard Gehlen gave the OSS when he surrendered and essentially became a member of U.S. intelligence. And so I think it's conspicuous that both myself and the other children in the project, certainly in the cadre of children that they were working with in my specific group in New Jersey, were all of either Italian-American, German-American, or some combination of Italian and German lineage. I think it's certainly possible that they may have identified some genetic heritage in Europe that they were interested in cultivating by involving us both in parapsychology activities and then in some of these more esoteric experiences involving different forms of time travel.
We've got a couple of questions from the chat room. Fiona wants to know, what does Andrew know about jump rooms to different locations and dimensions?
I had only one set of experiences involving two jumps in a jump room, and that jump room was essentially the elevator at a CIA facility in El Segundo, California, that I was taken to at age 19 by a CIA officer by the name of Courtney M. Hunt in the Los Angeles area. And that was essentially a large elevator, and we went up to the 5th floor and then checked in. There was a counter there with only one person working there. And Mr. Hunt provided my name, and then he said, "Okay, Andy, you can step into the teleporter." And having been involved in jumping through elliptical-shaped Tesla devices as a kid, I said, "Where is it?" And he said, "We just came up in it. It's the elevator." And then I stepped inside the elevator, went up to about the 8th floor, and Courtney had trained me for the jump room jumps that I would take to Mars, and had showed me how to use the helmet that had a communication and a respiration device in it. And they were belaboring sending me, and I finally got agitated. I think I said something like, "Light this candle," from the Mercury program. I think that was an Alan Shepard line, or John Glenn. But I got exasperated because they were just having me sit in the elevator for 15 or 20 minutes. I was getting agitated about actually going to Mars. So then I didn't really sense that we were moving, but after he said, "Okay, we're sending you now," the room gradually began to morph into more of a cylindrical shape. And about halfway to Mars, it took about 20 minutes to get there. About halfway through the journey, the room actually morphed into a cylinder. So, the corners of this box-like jump room actually morphed, and I found myself standing as if you would be holding your arm out and walking down a large pipe.
Right.
You couldn't really walk very easily, and the whole thing was now a cylinder. And then that righted itself, and the room became rectilinear again, box-like, and then it opened up, and as Mr. Hunt had described, I found myself in an underground base on Mars. And he had instructed me that I would see a stone or cement staircase over on my right, and I walked up that as instructed, and that went to a little sort of dugout area, a little room that was behind a large skull that was on the surface of Mars. On Mars, both the indigenous Martian civilization and, in some cases, the U.S. government, I don't know whether they built these or were in agreements with the Martians to actually use some of their underground bases, but essentially you can get onto the surface through the eyes of these skulls that dot the surface in different locations. So as he had described, you could walk off the surface.
I'm sorry. This is like a rock formation?
Yeah, well, it was sort of bone-like. It was like a big fossil or skull.
Really?
Archumenian, yeah.
Yeah.
But it was on the surface, so it was basically masking an access point up on the surface to this underground base. And so I walked out onto the surface, and I was there for about a minute, and a little human ran up. It was somebody from from Earth, some of the Earthling personnel that were up there. And he was laughing at me because I was yelling. I didn't need to yell because there was a microphone in my helmet. He didn't have a helmet on, so I said, "Can I take off my helmet?" He was clearly human, from here. And he was laughing pretty hysterically. And I finally took off my helmet, and I found I could breathe on Mars. And Bernie Taupin's lyrics notwithstanding, in Rocket Man,
Right.
Mars is not cold as hell. It was I would say about 60, 70 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
It was actually quite warm. The air there was breathable, but I found myself breathing with some difficulty. And certainly I felt, it was odd to be on the surface of another planet. And then after a few minutes, several more U.S. personnel strode up and just stood and sort of just hung out with me for about an hour. And then the second time I went up with Courtney, and we walked around the surface for 3 or 4 hours. And they wanted, I think, just to acclimate me to some of the things that were on Mars. So yes, I've had contact with one jump room, and when I was in Los Angeles in late November, I tried to find that building. I think it's probably the Grumman Aerospace Building in that cluster of aerospace buildings that you can see when you drive south from the Los Angeles airport. Okay. But whichever building it is there associated with the aerospace community in El Segundo, it certainly has seemingly changed position because of all that development south of the airport since 1981. It's not really in the same neighborhood that it was because the streetscape there has changed considerably. So I'm still trying to think.
Did they ever explain the technology behind it? Was it like a wormhole? When you went up to Mars, did you get the feeling that it was the same timeline as it was when you left? Or did you go?
Yeah, very much so. Unlike when we were jumping through portal tunnels in time space, there were a couple of key differences. One is obviously I was wearing a helmet and a respiration device. And the other thing is the room went with us. When we were teleporting during my childhood experiences, we were jumping through a device and jumping through a portal tunnel in the time-space continuum. This was a room that essentially went with you. A localized effect was being created, and the room was perhaps punched through a wormhole because clearly the jump room was effectuating the teleportation rather than the device creating a disequilibrium in the time-space continuum and us simply jumping through a sort of an interstitial chasm in the fabric of time-space. This was clearly a more advanced technology where the paradox is the room went with you. So when I never really changed my environment, it just morphed a little bit, and then the door opened, and what do you know? Now the jump room was on Mars. So that obviously involved some fifth-dimensional application of quantum physics that was really quite mystifying, and it was certainly very different than the experiences I had with teleportation in childhood.
Yeah, people oftentimes get a wormhole confused with what a stargate is. A stargate is like alternate timeline and space where you can show up at any time in any alternate universe. Whereas with a wormhole, it's linear time. It's the time. It's this time, or you leave, and then when you go to Mars, it's the same time you just left. You haven't gone in the future or the past. And I wonder how that works. I figure every place has a frequency. Like wherever that location is on Mars is like a certain frequency, and the device this room that you're standing in probably matches the frequency, and that's how you get there, back and forth.
I certainly think that it was a real-time transit, and both days, the jump up there by myself in the jump room was in July of '81, and then when I went up with Courtney, that was about a month later, late July, August time frame. And I certainly had the sense that it was a real-time journey, and that the time we spent on Mars when we jumped back via the jump room back to El Segundo, and then he drove me back to Chatsworth where my family was living and had lived for many years before and after that, that it was a real-time pattern of time, so there wasn't any offset for being on Mars at a different time-space coordinate as the real-time coordinate of Earth at that time. I think it was the entire experience was real-time, because when I arrived back he dropped me off in his car at the corner of Mason and Devonshire in Chatsworth, and then I walked home to the house that family that had in Chatsworth. And And so the afternoon had progressed, so I believe that it was a real-time set of experiences all the way through both of those days. But that's the only contact that I've had with jump rooms and with Mars, and that was long after I had done the more substantial stuff that I had done as a child at Project Pegasus. Perhaps they were testing to see how one of the children on the project would respond to the jump room experience. I know they had my Mars data going back 10 years before then, so it may have been an acclimation trip to enhance the quality of my Mars writings by having me go up there, because they were already starting to place personnel up there. I really have no explanation for why he insisted that I go up there, but when I refused, I initially declined, not so much because I didn't want to go to Mars and be, a courageous explorer of the universe, but simply because I really didn't want to get involved with Defense Department activities anymore. They had been stressful enough when I was a kid. But he insisted that I go up, and I said, well, why do I have to? And he said, because the survival of human life on Earth depends on it. I don't know what he meant by that, but that was certainly a good enough reason to go up, so I relented and agreed to go up during those two trips. But those are the only contact conferences that I've had.
Somebody in the chat room asked a question: was this project similar to Montauk? And it sounds like it, because I know someone who was at the Montauk project, and they gave him an explanation that was very similar to the one that was given to you, because he was in that from 1970 until the Montauk project closed down in 1983, and they were doing rather horrific experiments on him, and he went through a lot of mental and physical abuse there. And their excuse, he was told, was that mankind on its own can't take care of themselves. They can't rule themselves, and we need to do this to help mankind. Something similar to that. But how was it similar to Project Montauk?
Well, I think the way to distinguish the two programs, because I know that Project Montauk existed as well, so I affirm the statements that have been made about it by Stuart Swerdlow and by Preston Nichols and Peter Moon.
Right.
And the reason I know it existed is because we were jumping to moments in our own subjective future in the Montauk chair, beginning, for me, in the spring of 1970, which is when Dr. David L. Anderson of the Time Travel Research Institute has pinpointed the time when the Montauk chair was used throughout the United States, involving thousands of American school children in visiting subjective moments in their own future, so they could report back to the Defense Department, and the CIA what they were seeing when they were pre-experiencing these moments in their own future. So I know the chair existed. I also know that one of the names that surfaced in their literature is somebody that we knew personally on Project Pegasus, which was Jack Pruitt. Carl Jack Pruitt, born 1934, was one of the team leaders on Project Pegasus. He had a background with the U.S. Navy. And I first met Jack Pruitt in the summer of 1967 when there was an incident on the project that he responded to with my father. He was the person who trained us on the chronovisor at Morristown. He was sometimes the team who was present beginning in the summer of 1970 when we would teleport to the State Capitol complex in Santa Fe, and he would drive us to another location, for example, the Los Alamos National Labs or the Sandia Labs, where the teleport was that we would return to the East Coast. Now, Nichols and Moon identified Jack Pruitt as the research director for the Montauk Project, and that's entirely consistent because he was one of the team leaders on Project Pegasus. Now, the difference between the two projects, clearly, in Project Pegasus, they were involving a group of children in many forms of quantum access. I've counted 7, everything from doing conventional remote viewing for the Navy to literally jumping through Stargate devices to gather data from the future and bring it back.
Right.
I think what was done in the Montauk Project, and it explains why Stewart and others have shared such harrowing memories of being enrolled in Montauk. In fact, why I recognize it, and I'm quite grateful for the fact that I was in Pegasus rather than Montauk. I think they were trying to boost the performance of the Montauk chair because it allowed them to send somebody's mind to the future in an astral projection, or presumably to another location in the universe, such as an off-planet location, and then experience things there and then be safely returned in an astral sense, but never physically leave the chair. And if you read their account, it looks like they were using things like irradiating the entire room,
Yeah.
the chair within, or administering narcotics and then having the child report what they saw in the Montauk chair. So
Yeah.
I think that Pegasus and Montauk were clearly sister projects. I think the difference is that Montauk seems to have focused on an attempt to boost the performance of the Montauk chair and subject the percipient in the chair to different experiences and different field effects that might alter what they saw when they were on the astral projections that the chair prompted.
Stuart Swerdlow described it that they were trying to create a human being that could go into alternate realities without the use of technology. Also, they would often have a psychic that would sit in the chair, and then they would have they usually use mostly males because their psychic energy goes outward. So they would have several other children around the psychic where they were connected. They were the booster. There would the psychic would be the battery, and then the other children would be like a booster. And
well, that's partly consistent with what I experienced in the Montauk chair, and also and I was frequently having conversations with my father about the technology, and he explained the chair was a magnetic transducer. In fact, there was a coil on the back of the chair behind the solar plexus of the person sitting in the chair.
Right.
So it was actually creating a magnetic effect that boosted the psychic performance of the person sitting in the chair. And I asked one of the administrators of the project, how could we be visiting the future this way if the chair is not leaving the room? And he explained that either everything that happens to us is in our brain when we're born, or everything that's going to happen to us is in time waves out in the local environment, yet we can't perceive them yet. So by creating this magnetic field effect, the mind of the person sitting in the chair is boosted and pre-experiences moments in their own subjective future. But I would add that we know the provenance of several of the principal quantum access technologies that were under development. We know the teleporter was derived from Tesla's papers that had been seized by the War Department in 1943 and forwarded to Los Alamos. We know the chronovisors, which were these devices that propagated holograms of past and future scenes, was the work of two Vatican musicologists named Ernetti and Gemelli. But one of the black holes, one of the missing pieces of data that I went in search of during my 10-year investigation of my experiences in Project Pegasus was, where did the chair come from? And
right.
I think that the best indication is that it may have been reverse engineered from extraterrestrial technology.
Yeah.
And if that would
that's
explain
possible. I think Stuart explains it that it was an actual alien technology, because the story is years and years ago there was pyramids supposedly at Montauk, and one of the top of the pyramid was actually sticking out on there's a beach there. And the government, this is back I think maybe in the 50s or the 60s, they dug under the town because there's a town there. So they dug under the town and they found a pyramid under Montauk where the top part was sticking out on the beach, and they found alien technology inside here, and they built Camp Hero all around this. So
well, that certainly links up not only with my experiences in Pegasus but my Mars research. We know that the first civilization on Earth, which was the one that was largely decimated by a solar system catastrophe in 9500 BC, was the civilization that built the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx. We're not living in that civilization. We're living in a successor civilization that began around 3000 BC with extraterrestrial intervention in ancient Sumer. Okay, so that pyramidal culture that built the great megalithic pyramids of the Middle East and of Mesoamerica reached Mars. I mean, we have Egyptian and Central American data now in the NASA photographs from the surface of Mars. Just last year, my organization, the Mars Anomaly Research Society, found a rock with a carving, really an exquisite carving, of the face of an Egyptian pharaoh on the surface of the rock. We're calling it the Rosetta Stone of Mars. So that Egyptian culture, which also was building pyramids, not just in the Middle East, but in South and Central America reached Mars.
Right.
Now, we don't find any debris, we don't find any archaeological evidence of rocketry. I mean, we have the great platform at Baalbek in Lebanon, which certainly is large enough to be a space launch platform. But I think it's more probable that, in fact, they were reaching Mars via teleportation, just as we are. And they were also probably reaching it psychically with a device like the Montauk chair. So I find, as fanciful as that account is, I find it consistent with what I experienced in Pegasus and also what I'm finding on the surface of Mars. There's literally an Egyptian presence.
Yeah, well, isn't the face of Mars, that the face, did you ever get a good look at that? It's supposed to match the face that's on the Great Sphinx. And I think they're kind of lined up in such a way where they're looking at each other.
Well, we're finding Sphinx-like faces on Mars. We have the image of the pharaoh that we found on the rock in one of the spirit photographs. Not only has the distinctive conical headdress of the Egyptian pharaohs, but the cobra ready to strike motif, sort of coil snake.
A Kundalini symbol, yeah.
Yeah, well, that was Wadjet, who was the Lord Protector of Lower Egypt, and became the symbol of all of Egypt during the reign of the pharaohs, just as the bald eagle is the symbol for the United States of America. So the case has been proved now at this point that the culture that built the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx reached Mars, no doubt about that. So the notion that quantum access technology would be found in the United States, adjacent or beneath the pyramid, I think is entirely consistent with what we now know about the history of that previous civilization.
Yes, yeah. They recently found a mass grave of former workers, and they weren't slaves; they were paid workers that built the pyramid. Here's another question from Torchwood. He wants to know, does Andrew know if the Philadelphia experiment was used on Gulf War soldiers?
Boy, the only data I have from the Gulf War era is a statement that was made by Captain Ernest Garcia, who was the Army Security Attaché to Project Pegasus and was really to be commended for helping me as much as he did during the early years of my investigation into my experiences in Project Pegasus. And Captain Garcia informed me that we used hologram technology during the invasion of Baghdad to confuse Saddam Hussein and his military leaders about how many tanks were closing in on Baghdad. They essentially propagated, according to Captain Garcia, they propagated hundreds of extra tanks using the chronovisor technology, using essentially the blue beam technology where you create a hologram in the field to create some sort of psychological ploy to cause somebody to see something that's not actually there. I didn't gather any evidence that teleportation-based time travel was used during the Gulf War, or that any form of quantum access was used to in any way affect our troops. But I think those are the questions that we should be asking, because these technologies were developed 40 years ago. Hence, we know they can be applied in the field. For example, when Donald Rumsfeld, who was the defense attaché to Project Pegasus, spoke to us as a group of child teleportees in April of 1971 at the amphitheater that then existed at the Cerritos Cultural Center site, where the Stargate was located that we were using to access the distant future. He told us that the purpose or function of teleportation was primarily military, and it would allow the U.S. Army, the U.S. military, to put troops precisely where they were needed on the battlefield, because in their investigations of military history regarding the World War II experience, they found that most of our troops were killed or wounded not on the front lines, but in their attempt to reach the front line of the battle. And so they were eager to find a way to put troops exactly where they were needed without the deaths from accidents or snipers or even friendly fire that troops tend to encounter when they're moving forward to the front line. And so clearly we have to be cognizant of the fact that veterans of our current wars are certainly to be held as, in a prima facie sense, as credible when they say, I was teleported into my battle location, because that in fact was why teleportation was weaponized at the time of Nikola Tesla's death in 1943, and that's the context in which teleportation continues to be kept secret as a military means to put troops precisely where they're needed on the battlefield.
Right. I see a caller. Do you want to take a call?
Sure, that would be great.
Okay, let's see. I can click on it. 305. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
How you doing? Do you have a question for Andrew?
I don't know if I have a question. It's mind-boggling. It's amazing. I've been reading things on and off, like William Moore's book and so on and so forth, and coming up with my own theories. And what I'm going to say is going to sound basically stupid, but I don't know if you remember the movie Contact with Jodie Foster.
Yes,
Right.
Where she is put into this type of ellipsis. I don't know what it's called, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, that was probably a Stargate, or a wormhole they were creating.
Mm-hmm.
Or
with magnets and everything.
Mm-hmm.
That's what was brought to my mind as I was listening.
Yeah, because that device morphed when she started going, I guess, through time and space.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting.
Right. Well, I can say that I never saw or was placed in that type of device when I was attached to Project Pegasus. But, yeah, I think the commonality is that, like the jump room technology, the device actually morphs in order to bring her to another point in the time-space continuum. So, I mean, essentially ideas and technologies from these classified defense projects are being dropped into science fiction TV shows.
Or the other way around, because a lot of these science fiction films, I get the impression that it's a way of introducing this technology to the public.
Exactly.
And then, because oftentimes you'll see, wow, I saw that in Star Trek. Oh, it's just like Star Trek. Oh, it's just like Battleship Galactica, whatever that show's called. When it's really, they've already had that technology, but it's a way of kind of like introducing the public about this technology so that on a rather third or fourth grade level, so that when it does come into public consumption, you're not going to be taken aback or by it.
And it's not going to cause them to panic, which is the worst, emotion one can feel, because it just bewilders you.
Yeah.
When you're in panic. So, yeah, it makes sense.
Well, certainly the chair ride that she goes on, I can say that the Montauk chair wasn't that scary. I mean, she really accelerates in that chair. And she sort of doesn't really scream. She almost sort of spiritually screams the way they film it, which I think is really a harrowing scene. I had difficulty watching it because it reminded me of teleporting. I always had the sense that we would go slightly too fast and I would disintegrate or something. But I can say that particular technology was not something that I had any contact with, but I think it's a metaphor for the kinds of technologies that they had developed by 1970. Two other science fiction productions that I think are even more apt is, clearly they dropped teleportation into the American living room in 1966 when Star Trek debuted on American TV. The difference being that it was the opposite of what they had developed. I mean, on Star Trek, you stand on a platform and you're disintegrated and then reintegrated elsewhere. That's the quantum hologram that, in the public discussion of time travel, is currently still under development. The form of teleportation that DARPA had developed by 1970, in fact, did the opposite. It opened up a tunnel in the time-space continuum, and you passed through it uninjured, or at least usually uninjured. And then the classic example, germane to Project Pegasus, is that one of the devices was called a Stargate. And the project, at least those of us who were children on the project, we were told that the name of the project was Project Pegasus. I don't know what the adults were calling it. My father was always calling the project just the program. But in the first episode of Stargate Atlantis on television, the title of that broadcast was Project Pegasus. So this, I think, exemplifies the way in which the intelligence community has been working with the television industry in Hollywood to drop information about classified projects into really the best done science fiction, so that they can both inform the public about the ideas and the technologies involved, but also confuse people about the true nature of the technologies, and then, of course, create a basis of information to use disinformation to discredit whistleblowers like myself, because you don't then always say, well, you saw that on television.
Yes, I can see that happening.
So I think it's multidimensional.
In a novelized version, you can introduce a novel thought, a novel idea, and it's not scary.
Right. You can essentially script an alternate technology and then show some of the emotional impact of the quantum access experience, but then still not reveal what the government has. It would want to keep from its enemies, and I think, in a very anti-democratic way, keeping these technologies from the American people.
Now, Rumsfeld is saying that the teleportation is for the military, just to get them from one spot to the other. Like they really care about how fast or quickly they get to one area or another. Do you think that they're going to maybe the moons of Titan? They're going to other places in the solar system and not just Mars?
Well, when I was sent to Mars several times in 1981, there was already a U.S. presence there. Mm-hmm. At Exopolitics, European Exopolitics Summit in Barcelona, Spain, in July of 2009, the ufologist Bob Dean showed a satellite photo of an elaborate, a very large base on the surface of Mars. Mm-hmm. We know that when I teleported there in 1981, there were U.S. personnel who greeted me there. The second time I went up with Courtney Hunt, we walked about a quarter of a mile from the access point there on the surface and interacted with a man who had been on the surface for months and was under a great deal of stress. He was essentially having like an exposure crisis.
Right.
As a result of his attempts to stay alive there on the surface. Some of his personnel actually had already perished as a result of predators on the surface.
On the surface of Mars, predators?
Yes. And so he was in a state of extreme mental, I would say virtually mental collapse. It was like meeting a settler on the western frontier of the United States who had survived several battles or attacks by predatory animals or whatever. He was a mess basically.
What kind of predators are on Mars? Are they like mammals?
Yes. In fact, we were chased by one back to the skull.
What does it look like?
Well, they look like the plesiosaurs that existed on Earth, which is the reptile species.
Oh, so it wasn't a mammal, it was a reptile.
Well, a seal-like or Loch Ness Monster or Lake Monster-looking reptile. There are small reptiles on the surface of Mars that aren't as agile and fast as the smaller dinosaurs were on Earth, but certainly are carnivores. And this individual had spent a number of months on the surface, was quite distressed, and he was narrating to Mr. Hunt the individuals from his team that have actually perished as a result of predator activity on the surface.
They didn't give him any weapons. I mean, did his CO, supervisors, whoever, send him up there? Did they know about these predator animals that were there?
I think they did, and I often wonder why I was even exposed to that kind of danger the way I was, because, when we ran back to the skull, we actually dove into it. When we were scampering down the steps to get back to the jump room, I said to Courtney, is that a predator? I think I said, is that a predator? I think I said, is that a carnivore? And he said, hell yes, that thing has teeth all the way down its throat. So I think the U.S. was actually respecting the Martian protocol regarding life forms on the surface of Mars and not sending our personnel up there with weapons to defend themselves. There would also be the difficulty, obviously, of bringing metal objects through a teleportation experience. You can't do that because at least those that are conductive.
Oh, really? You can't bring metal objects with you through the teleportation?
Not unless they're an alloy that's non-conductive, like, let's say the zipper.
Did they say why? I mean, that sounds like that film Terminator. Everybody has to time travel and they show up naked because they can't bring metal with them.
Metal that's conductive produces a substantial amount of electrostatic discharge. So
okay.
it can't be tolerated in the teleportation process. But your question was, do I think we've reached more distant locations?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that certainly the facts create what we would call in the law a rebuttable presumption. And I'm an attorney by profession, and there's a concept in the law that when facts create something that then would have to be rebutted by new facts, you've got a rebuttable presumption. So I think the presumption is that we've gone far past Mars with the jump room technology, because I was sent up there 28 years ago.
Right.
You know, David Wilcock has stated in his interview with Henry Deacon, and we now know that Henry's actual name is Arthur Neumann, who's somebody around my age who went up to Mars for the NSA, that there may be as many as 500 to 600,000 U.S. personnel on Mars.
Wow.
So do I think that these 30 years they've gone far past Mars? I would say it's a rebuttable presumption that they have.
How do they recruit that many people to go up there?
Well, I was approached individually by somebody from the CIA.
Right. I
So
guess.
I assume individuals in the military and who have worked in different capacities in the defense technical community
Mm-hmm.
would be candidates, college students, athletes.
Yeah. Go to the Ivy League schools and approach the science and engineer students. Yeah.
I mean, I had a background working really in a very esoteric area of human experience as a child in terms of time travel.
Right.
And I had resumed the semblance of a normal life, but I was still disturbed by the authenticity. I was questioning the authenticity of Courtney Hunt's question to me when he said, well, do you want to go to Mars?
Mm-hmm.
You know, there was a time there where I was at Justin, and he was continuing to communicate to me that he was asking a serious question, and,
Right.
and neither, kidding me, nor had he lost his mind. And when I asked him, well, how are we getting up there by rocket? He said, you know how we can get people places.
Yeah.
So I realized we're teleporting to Mars. So there was a period initially there in June of 1981 when he first entered my life where I thought he was crazy, because I couldn't believe that in 10 years the teleportation technology had been used to reach Mars, but in fact it had. So we know that the teleportation, the development of quantum access continued after the early 1970s when I was one of the child chrononauts that were working with. It was far advanced by 1981. So now in 2010, 28 years, 29 years later,
Right.
presumably they've gone to other planets, at least those that are not too hot, and maybe outside the solar system.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised. Well, we're coming up to the top of the hour, and I thought we would take a break at this time. You feel like taking a break?
Certainly, that would be great.
Okay. We'll be back in 5 minutes. Now, the call-in number is 646-478-51 if you would like to call in and speak to Andrew, or you can post your questions in the chat room. We'll see you in a few minutes, in about 5 minutes. Okay, you're listening to After Dark Radio at blogtalkradio.com, and I am your host, Anthea, and we're speaking to Andrew Basiago tonight about the Pegasus Project. And we just remind everybody that the call-in number is 646-478-5194. Andrew, you still there?
Yes.
How you doing? Those two moons of Phobos that are up there, I've heard that they're really artificial weapons, because I think the Russians years ago, I don't know, it was in the late 80s, they sent a probe to Mars, and one of the, I think it was Phobos, moved and then zapped it with a laser.
I don't know if Phobos moved, but if you look at the history of U.S. and Russian probes to Mars, they certainly have a very checkered history, as if there were attempts made by the indigenous humanoid civilization on Mars to repel the arrival of probes from the Earth to the Martian civilization, which we believe that the intelligent humanoid civilization on Mars, based on photographic evidence and an encounter I can describe that I had with my father with 3 Martian astronauts who were leaving, but there's been some sort of policy shift, because in 1970, the human population on Mars, the ones that look essentially like us and may very well be our long-lost relatives from before the solar system catastrophe of 9500 BC, when
Right.
the two cultures were separated by that disaster. They were collaborating with our government in the early 1970s, and then we have the fact that later probes to Mars were apparently shot down, including Phobos 1 and 2. So this creates some doubt as to what the posture is in regard to the U.S. and other world governments interfacing with the human civilization on Mars. This is really one of the gray areas that really needs to be articulated if we're to be
because they don't seem to be shooting down our probes or our rovers that we send up there.
No, the rovers have reached there successfully. Our personnel have reached there via teleportation. But as regards Phobos, we have the conventional story that they were shot down. Now, one possible explanation is, since we have the accounts of myself and others about teleporting there, and since we also have accounts of Martian astronauts interacting with our aerospace engineers. In fact, after I discussed this publicly, one of my law clients shared the fact that she had worked as a secretary for Howard Hughes. You know, I haven't talked about this or written this. I have to write this up.
Right.
She was working as a secretary for Howard Hughes at Hughes Aircraft, and she claimed that two Martians came to the counter that she was working at because they were visiting Earth requisitioning parts from Hughes Aircraft. So there's another account of an impartial witness like myself who can confirm that the Martian human civilization has been in liaison with our aerospace technical community. So I think that the Phobos shoot-downs may be a disinformation ploy that the Russian space program and government cooperated with our government.
Yeah, I think the Russians and the U.S. have always been together on the space program.
I said, do you think they may have been kidding you? And she said, no. Mr. Hughes told me that several astronauts from Mars dressed as conventional humans would be coming to my desk or counter there, whatever, my work area, and that I should help them just as I would help any human who was asking what parts could be requisitioned from Hughes Aircraft. And she was utterly sincere. So I really have to get her permission to tell her story, because it's another one that shows that, quite separated in time, I might add, but again, going back to the 1960s and early 1970s, indicating that the human civilization on Mars was actually in liaison with our government by no later than 1970. So I think the best response that I can give regarding the Phobos shoot-downs would probably be that they were a disinformational ploy to suggest that there was hostile fire from a defensive population on Mars.
Well, how about recently, what's the name of that astronaut? Edgar, who was it? What's the name? He was on a news program, I think it was C-SPAN, where he talked about that there is a monument, a man-made monument on one of the moons of Mars.
Right, that was astronaut Edwin Buzz Aldrin, the second man to...
Yeah, okay, Aldrin.
Who was interviewed on C-SPAN back on July 20th of 2009 during the 40th anniversary of the lunar landing. And Buzz spoke about his desire that we expand our exploration of Mars and place human astronauts there and ultimately colonize Mars. And he focused on a monolithic monument on Phobos. And I admire astronaut Aldrin tremendously. He was certainly one of the heroes of my childhood, growing up as the son of an aerospace community with posters of the space program on my bedroom wall. His beautiful daughter Jan sang at my sister's wedding in 1980. She sang an exquisite rendition of the 12th of Never, and that was really special for our family to meet Jan and have her sing at my sister's wedding. So I would view Buzz at least as a family friend by one degree of separation, but I really take issue with the statements that he made on July 20th. For one thing, he created the impression that we haven't been to Mars, and those of us in the time-space program who have accomplishments as estimable as his accomplishment landing on the moon beg the difference. We've already been on Mars, and the American people have a right to know that. He also ignored the really extensive data that my organization, the Mars Anomaly Research Society, has collected, showing that even if you don't believe my account that we've been on Mars, I've been on Mars and others have, there's clear, convincing, and cogent data that now shows that Mars is inhabited. And that really begs the third issue, which is he was suggesting that we should colonize Mars. And I take issue with that because Mars is inhabited, we should not even be thinking in terms of colonizing a neighboring planet in our solar system. Indeed, any inhabited planet in the cosmos. We should proceed on the basis of the Prime Directive and not interfere in the indigenous Martian civilization. We should go there at most as guests, not as invaders or colonizers. And I was very disturbed that a scientist and space explorer as distinguished as Buzz Aldrin was suggesting during the 40th anniversary of the lunar landing that we should colonize Mars because this would really be a provocative action. And I think it's really a matter of interplanetary security significance as far as I'm concerned.
Would you like to take another phone call?
Sure, yeah.
There we go.
Fire away.
There we go. 951, you're on the air.
Hi, Anthea. It's Denichi. Sorry, I'm late.
Hi. How you doing?
I was late for my temporal sciences classes, and then I got out, and then I heard Andrew was on. And hi, Andrew. How you doing, man?
Hi there, Anthony.
Denichi, don't you remember?
The two of you met?
Way back. One time. Yeah. Hey, Andrew, you never told Anthea about the time you came to Pasadena.
You mean during one of my experiences in Pegasus?
Mm-hmm. JPL or Caltech, either one.
Right. What happened was in the summer of 1973 that we were pre-accessing or pre-experiencing after having teleported there from mid-November of 71. I was living in a rental house in White Rock with my dad, and we returned back to the house from lunch with his friend Connie Chavez, and the project files were missing from the house. And these were the logs of people teleporting in and out of New Mexico, which my father was keeping. In fact, at one point, they were being kept behind the counter at the La Hacienda restaurant in Old Town Albuquerque. That's how esoteric some of the concealment of this black project data was. Sometimes it was hanging out in some public venue like that because nobody would think of checking behind a restaurant counter to find a log of teleportees for a DARPA defense project. And so my father told Connie and I, you've got 5 minutes to clear out everything out of the house that you want to keep. And so she went into the kitchen and started throwing pots and pans and boxes that were there. I went into my bedroom and started packing up my clothes from that summer. And we went on a cannonball run. We dropped Connie off in Old Town Albuquerque. And then my dad and I drove at a very high rate of speed to Pasadena at an office of Parsons. Now, Parsons would move to Pasadena, actually originally from Los Angeles in 1972. But they already had some exploratory offices, some provisional offices out in Pasadena near JPL and Caltech.
And in between is the Don Parsons Group building.
Well, the founder of Parsons was Ralph M. Parsons, and he was linked to Stephen Bechtel and John McCone of the CIA. You know, Stephen Bechtel, the founder of Bechtel Engineering, and then John McCone of the CIA. And a lot of what Parsons did over the years were actually defense projects. I mean, they were responsible for designing and building the MX missile system. And in fact, when Ralph M. Parsons bought Adnan Khashoggi's yacht in 1972, which at that time was the largest private yacht in the world, he named it Pegasus II in honor of the project that he organized that gave the U.S. government operational time travel, even though the yacht and nor anything he had ever owned had ever been named Pegasus or Pegasus I. But we drove to Pasadena, and essentially because we scrambled. My dad didn't want to go up to Sandia and teleport anywhere. We had to basically leave in a car and just scramble out of the area because essentially that location and the project had been compromised at that point. So we were sort of in an emergency effort to just scramble and hide in the woodwork, as it was. So his decision was to drive to Los Angeles. We met with a fellow Parsons engineer in Pasadena, where Parsons would move their whole headquarters a couple of years later. And after that meeting, I was instructed to jump through a teleport there back to the East Coast. And this just shows you a child's understanding of what was going on. I refused to jump through the device because I was concerned that I would arrive 1,500 miles east of New Jersey because we had driven the distance from Albuquerque to Pasadena, or 1,000 miles or whatever. So I was having difficulty conceptualizing the fact that when they were asking me to jump through the teleport there at Pasadena, that I would arrive back at Curtis Wright, and from there be driven home or back to school, or some context would be found to involve me in getting back on track back in November of '71, which is what they were sending me back to. So that's one of the sort of contingency type things that was done during a moment in the project really of searing distress, because we realized that the project files had been stolen, and so we took evasive action, essentially.
Oh. Now,
so there were moments of pure terror like that, certainly of where we had to just get up and respond to a crisis, and my father certainly perceived that as a crisis. In fact, when I was walking out to the car, I was pressing my briefcase together because my father had bought a briefcase and some clothes for me there after I teleported there. And we didn't just want to abandon stuff in the house there, so he had me put it in the car. And so I brought it to the car holding not the briefcase, but a suitcase together. And a little boy's plastic comb fell out. And he said, let it go, Andy, just throw your stuff in the car. And then we sped off from the front, sort of zero-scaped front yard there of that house in White Rock. When I went back in June of 2003 during my first fact-finding trip, first of 3 major fact-finding trips to New Mexico, I found that comb on the front yard of that property. In fact, it had shrunk considerably in the sun for 35 years. But, that was a situation where, because we were on an emergency basis, I really couldn't conceptualize that if I jumped through the device there, I would arrive in New Jersey rather than in Missouri or someplace. So I think I was telling Anthony about that. Was that the anecdote that you were thinking of, Anthony?
Something like that. Your project there were similar projects, especially in that area from Pasadena, which is where I'm from, which is where I got my subject matter learning on temporal sciences and other aspects of that. There were a lot of children in that time period where, should I say, experimented on different ways. Where they had your group doing one thing, they had a parallel group, and that group was in Pasadena, and they were very adamant at keeping it in the family, if you will. So they went out to find some of the guys, including my father, which that was amazing what they put him through. But they got guys from the Strategic Air Command, and those guys were out of March Air Force Base at the time. And some of the guys lived in the area. They would kind of like lump together, and they would take us down to the base, and we'd go into a hangar, and the things we would see was just, you don't forget things like that. And they would tell us that, there were things going on Mars. And I remember first time seeing the SR-71. And I said, how far can that jet go? He said, very, very far. And what do you mean by very, very far? And then one of the other pilots was joking. He said, this thing can go to Mars and back. And I never heard anything else like that before. It's an amazing jet. But, they were doing a lot of projects sending people up there to Mars, even to today.
Right. Yeah. We have the statement made by Bob Beckwith. I interviewed Bob twice. He obviously was quite elderly. He was in his 80s during both interviews. But he stated that the teleportation capability was placed on the stealth aircraft, and that was one of the reasons stealth were so expensive. They couldn't use anything that was metallic, at least that was conductive metal. And so if you remember, the price tag of the F-14 and F-15 strategic bombers jumped from $100 million to $2 billion per plane when the stealth program, the B-1 and the B-2 bomber programs were launched. And I believe that Bob is a truth teller. I remember interacting with him both professionally and socially when I was a child on Project Pegasus. And he confirmed that the teleportation capability is not only on the stealth, but in fact is on some of our Navy ships. And he had an afternoon on a Navy ship in Tampa Bay where the captain of the ship showed him the teleportation control mechanisms in the helm of the ship that allow the ship to move around to different locations instantaneously on the surface of the ocean. And this, in fact, Anthony, is one of the reasons I'm speaking out, because people are dropped into the military. For example, undoubtedly many of our stealth pilots are probably U.S. Air Force Academy graduates, and there has been an underemphasis in terms of what's going on medically with people exposed to the teleportation technology.
Yeah.
I had a brief with Jack Pruitt in the summer of 2003 in which he explained that we were being pretty severely dehydrated when we would jump through the tunnels in the time-space continuum that the teleports were creating. And I'm speaking out of a sense of basic morality, so that people who are serving in classified positions in the U.S. military need to know that the teleportation technology is not neutral as to their later health profile. It is having biomedical consequences that perhaps are not being revealed to them. For example, to the pilots of the stealth aircraft when they are teleporting. So this is another issue that was really the inspiration for my Truth campaign, is to, on the one hand, lobby the government to disclose these technologies, try to find a way to make them entirely medically safe and introduce them so that they can become part of the transportation infrastructure of the 20th century around the world, but also engage in disclosure now so that people who might be harmed by the technologies, if they haven't been made entirely medically safe, at least will know, they'll have the benefit of knowledge that that the technology is not entirely safe biomedically speaking, and that they may have later health problems related to their military service in the same way that our troops have been extensively contaminated with depleted uranium.
Well, maybe that's what they were testing for in the early days with many of the children, is the health risk.
Well, they knew that. That's why they created the hybrid project, which I was a part of. That's how I got the chromosome 22q11 that was from the Gulf War. They directed every moment of your life when you're in those projects, and you know this, Andrew, every moment of your life is directed in some way by these groups. And they go out of their way to make you seem unbelievable. They do covert ops on you. They do continuous surveillance. And unless you can actually, if you have training in intel like I do, and also covert ops, I wouldn't be able to get around it. What you're talking about, yes, the exposure to temporal radiation. You're familiar with that as well, right?
Well, I mean, we were becoming severely dehydrated when we were jumping through the teleport and arriving in New Mexico. I mean, we would spend 3 minutes at the water fountain. So, in fact, that was the only medical side effect that Donald Rumsfeld revealed to us during his April 1971 meet and greet.
And here's the key: he was the same. He was the leader, head of the Defense Department when I was in during the Gulf War, when they with the shots, with the depleting uranium, and some of the experiments that they did that were bizarre. They wanted to create a super soldier so they can send through one of those time tunnels. And they thought it would be such a great idea, but they weren't prepared for the Philadelphia experiment results.
But is all of this technology, because when your father was working on the ramjet, it was designed specifically for chasing UFOs. So is all the technology that's being created now have UFOs in mind? Because, I mean, look who the enemy is that we're fighting now. They're these ragtag men in mountains. It's not like we're fighting an enemy that has high-tech technology, too. My brother was in the Iraq War. He went in 2003, and he was telling me that he was seeing things that he couldn't believe, weapons. He was in awe. It was like science fiction. So I've come to the conclusion that maybe the weapons, the things that are being created is maybe to fight an enemy that is not earthly.
Well, I think that, you make a good point. It's clear that if we put this in historical context, when I was a participant in Project Pegasus in the early 1970s, the two principal groups that the U.S. military and defense community were concerned about, I speak of them as the Greys and the Reds. Basically, they knew that different extraterrestrial groups began to visit our planet extensively after we began blowing up nuclear weapons and essentially tearing the fabric of time-space. Nuclear fission literally tears or creates an inexorable collapse at the subatomic level of the physical substrates of the universe. That was extremely destructive to begin doing. So we know that different extraterrestrial races around the cosmos became concerned about that and began sending sorties of teams to explore who we were and why we were doing this. And we know that even from the July 1947 UFO flap, that there was clear intent, not just regarding our military bases, but locations within the defense nuclear procurement system that were radioactive, such as Oak Ridge, such as the Trinity site in New Mexico where the first atomic bomb was blown up, such as Southwest Washington where the Hanford Nuclear Reservation began receiving nuclear waste.
And there was a story I heard that I always believe there's always been an alien presence here on Earth, and I think there was other alien groups watching us. But as long as they watched us, they didn't have a problem with it. But there was a story of a being from Tall Ceti who landed somewhere out in the desert somewhere, and they called him Frank because they really couldn't pronounce his name. And he was grabbed, and they took him off somewhere, and he was eventually executed, this alien being, this Tall Cetian. Supposedly, they have an issue with the beings that are known as the Greys, and they have sworn to kill them wherever they find them. Of course, they're here on this planet. So when that happened, then Earth was off limits to any other alien groups that were not welcomed here, and that's when they created, I think it was called the Earth Battalion, which they started listing all the number of different UFO ships or other alien races that were not welcomed here. I heard that story.
Well,
we're down to our last 2 minutes.
Well,
I think we have.
Yeah, just to follow up, I think it's clear that quantum access was emerging to give the U.S. National security community weaponry to potentially counter visitors who are operating in that realm. So I think there's definitely a connection there. The other group, of course, we're told were the Soviets, but in fact, Courtney Hunt, the CIA officer that they put in my life, claimed that the Cold War was actually artificially puppeted between powers to actually create an extraterrestrial defense posture. So the Soviets were never really our adversaries. Now, of course,
I believe that. We're down to our last minute. We only did a 90-minute show. But I would love to invite you back again to continue this conversation and about Mars. Is so much
to come back. A lot on Mars. So, Anthea, if we could, if I could come back and really go through what we're finding on Mars, it's really phenomenal. Yeah. I mean, right now I have 40 major discoveries that I still have to write up.
Yeah, and let me just remind everyone that your website is projectpegasus.net, and then you have, what's the other one, mars.com?
No, I'm placing my Pegasus revelations at projectpegasus.net, and my Mars findings and the findings of my colleagues at the Mars organization at projectmars.net.
Okay, so projectmars.net for information on what's on Mars, life on Mars. Okay. I think we're getting a countdown now, 27 seconds. And I want to thank you, Andrew, for being here, and Denichi for calling, and for the person 305 who called. And we had a packed chat room. And I guess we'll say goodnight, and thank you for listening. And we'll see everyone next week, same time, same place. Good night, everyone.